So thank you very much, Nina, and thank you all for having me. Can you hear me? This is my morning voice. Theater people don't get up this early normally. I want to give sort of an overview, and if you all know all this, please raise your hands and I'll just move forward. But I don't think a lot of people do know sort of where the Los Angeles area fits in the historic theater world, the wonderful world of historic theaters. I've traveled all over the world, and my family will vouch that anytime we go into any town, big or small, I will seek out any historic theater there, take pictures, try to wind my way into the door and check them out. So it's been a lifelong passion. It did all start at the Rialto Theatre when my mother took me at about 8 years old. She took me to fall in love with silent movies, which I did, but I also fell in love with the theater, and theaters in general, historic theaters in general. What is it about a historic theater that captures my imagination? And I think the reason that they exist is because they were created in a very unique way. They were created to give someone a feeling, to create an environment, a fantasy environment, an escape from reality. The sort of the high point of historic theater building was in the teens and 20s and early 30s. So we were going through depressions, we were entering and exiting wars. People were looking for an escape, and historic theaters created that escape. So it wasn't about what movie you saw, it was about walking into something that looked like an Egyptian palace, or a French palace, or an Egyptian tomb, or a Mayan temple, or a Chinese palace again. Palace keeps coming up. So those were the sort of the fantasies that we were trying to create. Now, Los Angeles is unique. Los Angeles is very unique in the city because the Hollywood film industry sort of grew at the same time as the historic theater style. So there were plenty of other theaters in other towns. Chicago has, of course, a great collection of theaters. New York has a great collection of theaters. But Los Angeles actually has the largest amount of movie palaces in the world, one city. If you look at other theaters, other theater towns, those were built for a legitimate theater. The majority of the Los Angeles theaters were built for movies. Yes, they have a stage, they presented vaudeville, but they were primarily built for movies. So that makes us unique. We also have, in our city or in our county, we have a number of theater districts, and that is another rarity. We have the Downtown Broadway Historic Theater District, which is one of the oldest and the very first theater district put on the National Register. We have the Hollywood Theater District, which is actually later, and then we have a Wilshire Corridor, we have a Westwood District. These are all actually legitimately defined as districts, and why do I think that's important? The reason to have a theater district is because that's now a destination. People will go to this area and say, I want to see a show. I don't know what I want to see, but I want to see a show, so I'll go to the district and figure it out. Glendale also has, it had a very thriving district. Now we're down to about 2 theaters, including the Alex. At one point there were 15 theaters, mostly along the Broadway corridor. But all but 2 of those historic theaters are now gone. So
where are they? What's the second one?
The second one is, I think it's now called the Stars, and it was the Roxy when I was a kid. So that's it, but there were 15 at one point. So you see this all over the place, and that's why what we've got is so important. Downtown, there were about 150 theaters over the history. And the Broadway Theater District that we think of, that those of us in the business think of as the theater district in Los Angeles, is actually the 3rd theater district downtown. So we had 80 theaters that were on Main and Spring before Broadway was even Broadway. So this is why what we've got is so important to hold on to. The LA Historic Theater District was founded about 33 years ago. Sort of a pivotal moment in theater preservation, because we were in a development era where people were coming and tearing these things down. They were saying, well, there's no value to this big old empty building. Everyone's watching movies at home, so why keep them? And we lost 3 theaters in very close succession, and that was when the Theater Foundation was formed. And at one point there was a theater that will still bring tears to my eyes in downtown called the California. And I was there the day that bulldozers were tearing it down. We were in there trying to grab light fixtures or whatever we could. And we took a picture, a picture of the marquee, and just, you know, it had the letters up there saying never again. So we're beyond that point, luckily. It's very rare that someone's going to just tear down a theater. They might turn it into a restaurant or a video game parlor or something like that. But we're not worried about the bulldozers anymore. We are worried about advocacy and trying to activate the theaters. So that's really part of what we do. I want to give a little bit of background about the sort of growth of historic theaters in our area. I will not relate it to the other cities because we've got a very unique situation here. When the theaters started being built, it was the birth of the film business in Hollywood. So even though production was really East Coast originally, when production started coming to California, we started building movie palaces. The earliest theater in Los Angeles was built in 1871, and it still exists. The earliest theater that was built in Los Angeles that still exists is down in the Olvera Street area, and it's the Merced Theater, 1871. But that was a legitimate theater. We weren't obviously showing movies at that time. The first legitimate theater in downtown that was built for movies was the $1 Million Theater, and the $1 Million Theater still exists. Now this is an amazing place. It was Sid Graumans' very first Los Angeles theater. In fact, when he came down from San Francisco, he just called it the Graumans Theater because his name was actually big enough that it was more important than the movies that he was showing. So you went to a Graumans Theater for the spectacle, for the show. That theater still exists on 3rd and Broadway. It was built in 1917. And it's an insane, crazy mix of architecture, which is one of the hallmarks, I think, of the movie palace. You know, you might find something that is a French Revival style theater, but within that French Revival, there's going to be some crazy Art Deco things, or there's going to be, well, in the case of the $1 Million, it's got everything. There's Corinthian columns, there's Egyptian motif, there's Spanish Revival stuff, there's Moorish things. There's Art Deco, all of this mushed together in what I like to call Hollywood fantasy. There are very few forms of architecture that will do this, that will say, that looks good, I'll take some of that, and ooh, this is fun, and create something completely new. So, in my opinion, and yes, I'm biased, I think the historic theater architecture is sort of a thing unto itself, and yet another reason to save it, not just because it's pretty and weird, but because it also has a unique place in our society. It's the only form of architecture that people will, one of the only forms of architecture that people will go to by choice to experience something in the dark with total strangers. Right? And that is a pretty rare thing. And as our society moves through different phases of wanting to be all alone and looking at your phone and, like this, I think we seek out social engagement, and so historic theaters in general are still a place where we can get that. Boy, did I go off on a tangent. I was trying to talk about history, and now I'm talking about iPhones.
No, that was the comedy part. That was good.
True, though, true. See, the best comedy is rooted in truth, right?
That's right.
So downtown, that's our first real theater district in Los Angeles. Why downtown? Because downtown Los Angeles was the focal center of commerce, of shopping. If you wanted to go buy the best hat in town, you'd go downtown. If you wanted to find the finest restaurants, you'd go downtown. So we were still a very centralized city. We had public transportation. We had the red cars and yellow cars and things. Downtown was still the focal point. This really was all the way up until the mid-20s when we first started seeing the growth of the neighborhood movie palace, which is not an official term, but that's what I call things like the Alex, things like the Rialto. They're not official movie palaces. They're not big enough to be called that. But they are. They're elegant. They're a fantasy world. They're the crazy architecture. Those all started in approximately the mid-20s and into the 30s. And this was sort of the beginning of decentralization. The communities all started having their own identity. They all started developing commercial districts. If you look around Los Angeles County, a lot of these smaller communities, these satellite communities, or even separate towns like Glendale, they were developing business districts and having main streets and all of this stuff that started decentralizing. Then we had World War II, and that really kicked decentralization into gear. We had the GI Bill. People were coming home and having enough money to buy a suburban home. And once the suburbs started growing, that really kicked downtown into the gutter. There was no centralization anymore. People had their shopping centers. They had their local movie palaces, their local shopping districts, and downtown emptied out. And so we now saw these big, beautiful movie palaces, some built for 3,000 people, sitting essentially empty except for the video games in the lobbies. And we really saw, post-war, there were additional theaters being built too, but post-war, that decentralization is really what sort of killed the movie palace. Now, we were lucky in downtown Los Angeles. We were lucky in Hollywood that some of these theaters basically just got ignored. And because they're ignored, they're still here today. If that had been part of the retail redevelopment and the commercial redevelopment, those theaters probably would have been torn down in much greater numbers. But the fact that they're still there is because people ignored downtown, thank goodness. When I was a kid, I went down to explore downtown. I made movies about being the last boy on earth because I could literally go there on a weekend and not see anybody else. And that's, essentially what saved these, as well as the Hispanic population that did use downtown as a shopping district and still do today. And so really being ignored, and the Hispanic population that used it is the only reason we have these movie palaces. So moving beyond downtown, we had Hollywood. That started up. One of the big famous ones, of course, is Graumans Egyptian Theater, which is still there today as the Egyptian Theater. American Cinematheque shows classic movies in there. That was Graumans' second, that was his big move. So he comes from San Francisco, builds the $1 million, blows everyone away with that theater, and basically moves to Hollywood and brings attention to Hollywood Boulevard. After that, of course, the most famous theater, arguably in the world, the Chinese Theater, was again Sid Grauman's masterpiece, and he really created a lot of what we think of as Hollywood glitz and glamour. The red carpet, that's a Sid Grauman invention. That wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the Egyptian and the Chinese theater. The footprints, of course, some people say that was a mistake. I think it was brilliant marketing, and it's still used today as brilliant marketing. We still do the footprint handprint ceremonies on a fairly regular basis, and it brings attention to Hollywood, it brings attention to the Chinese, and most of all, it brings attention to the film business, which is still a thriving and important industry in Los Angeles. So Hollywood being our next big district. Talked about going to the neighborhoods. This created a lot of, post-war, we had a lot of new theaters that were built. In the 50s, we had a lot of very simple, not very ornate theaters, but still very important because it was part of keeping people in their neighborhoods and decentralizing downtown. So where do we go now? And this is the fun part. This is also where the Theater Foundation, mainly differs from preservation organizations. Most preservation organizations that you've heard of, the LA Conservancy being one of the biggest, but other historical societies, their goal is to preserve and protect historic buildings. They're beautiful, they've got history, and I'm all for all of that. One of the things the Theater Foundation does differently, if you look at our mission statement, we preserve, protect, restore, same as everyone else, and sustain. And this is a really important part of the Theater Foundation's philosophy, is that a beautiful historic theater is basically an empty box without an audience. So our goal is to sustain the business of a historic theater, get butts in seats. That's how we measure success. and that is actually an industry-wide term. I didn't make it up. But you know, a successful theater is not a pretty empty box. A successful theater is one that's full of people enjoying whatever form of art that theater creates. We believe so strongly in that we may bend some of the preservation rules and piss off other preservation organizations, because sometimes in a historic theater, for instance, you have to have upgraded sound, or you have to have LED lighting, or you have to have well, wheelchair ramps I'm all for, but you know, you may have to make compromises that a strict preservation organization wouldn't make. And that's what we feel is important in order to sustain these businesses. Last year, it's 2016, but every year we give 2 awards. And both of our awards this year were actually given to the Alex Theater. The Preservation, the Theater of the Year Award, and the Distinguished Star for, no, the Gold Star for Distinguished Service, that's an individual award. Both of those went to the Alex Theater, which is a really great example of a sustained theater. It's gone through many ownership changes, it's gone through organizational changes. They're a thriving business with a really diverse and interesting program. And programming is key, and what they bring to the Alex stage and screen, we felt was well deserving of the award, not only because they've kept the butts in seats, but they've done it in a really distinguished way. They've preserved this theater, which I've gone to ever since I was a kid, in a beautiful way and very respectful of the architecture. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Alex, there's 2 important periods, and I of course have to look at dates because I don't remember dates. Numbers are not my friend. The Alex opened in 1925 as the Alexander Theater, and its style was really sort of a Greek revival. That's not what most people who look at the Alex think of. If once you're inside, it's more apparent. But most people see the spire, they see the forecourt. And all of that is S. Charles Lee, and that came in 1940. Yeah, 1940, I got it. Yes?
So was that the Alexander Theater, sort of like the Egyptian? It was supposed to be like that?
Exactly.
Got it. I
Yes.
never heard that before, so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look beyond the canopy and the spire, you'll see these
Right.
motifs.
It all makes sense now. I
Yeah.
just wasn't aware.
Absolutely. So, and they were built around the same time. Oh, that brings up a really great thing. Why Egyptian? Why Chinese? Why Mayan? Why Moorish? You know,
why
why?
were they discovering King Tut's tomb or something?
You took the words out of my mouth, because at the time, no, you're absolutely right. Thank you. At the time, these were what was exotic. So we were. The Western culture was becoming aware of China, and so wow, we can go and get some Chinese
And the
antiques.
curse of the mummy.
We got all of that, exactly. So, the Spanish Revival era, when all you had the Chigueresque style and all of these things that Balboa down in San Diego, the Spanish Revival thing, this is all at the same time. This is all basically early 20s or mid 20s and early 30s.
Wow.
So it's whatever we thought was exotic. Now, if you were to build a historic theater today, we'd have to look and say, well, what does our current culture think is exotic? I actually have no idea what that would be. But at the time, if you look at what was the fantasy of our culture at the time, those were the things. And yes, so Egyptian, Greek, all of those. So the Alex is a beautiful example. I can't go without mentioning the Rialto because that's my baby. The Rialto is a wonderful mix of Moorish, of Spanish Revival, of Egyptian. I had a photographer in there who's photographed historic theaters all over the world, and he said, "Oh my God, this is the first one I've seen that had actual Egyptian, painted elements or whatever." He got so excited about the Egyptian things. It's full of all of that, and it's basically stuck in time. What's special about the Rialto is that it hasn't been redone, it hasn't been remodeled, or remodeled, as some of us like to say. It's in original condition. You can walk to the backstage of the Rialto Theatre and see a vaudeville backdrop from the 30s. You can see dressing rooms with civil defense crackers and water stored there from decades ago. It's definitely stuck in time. It's been leased by a church, Mosaic Church, recently, and my first reaction was about 3 days of depression, and then I started talking to the church members, and I suddenly realized, well, now they get to raise all the money to restore it. All I have to do is stand around and say, don't do that. Yeah. So I get to be the old curmudgeon theater preservation guy, and they have to raise all the millions of dollars. Yay, thank you. They've also said that we'll be able to eventually do some programming for the public so that it won't be an all church all the time place, and that's really an important part to me because these theaters are part of the community. And if you look at the Alex, you look at the Rialto, you'll talk to people who have generations of memories of first kisses in the balcony, of seeing their first movie with their kids, of going on that date. These are places that were built to create memories, and I think that's why they still have value. Yes.
So what are I'm curious about the Rialto. So what are the desires of the church for the space versus your preservation requirements?
That's a hard question to answer very specifically because they are not saying exactly what they want to do. The good thing is that they have hired a very reputable historic resources architecture firm to do what's called the Historic Building Survey, which is a very in-depth survey of every element of the theater that exists that has historic value. And they've hired this at an extreme cost, and I've consulted with this company to make sure that they've noticed, hey, did you note that little piece? That's original, So we've worked into they really are doing their best to acknowledge what is historic about the building. This church has a lot of performance-based programming, so there's music and live performance as part of their ceremonies, services. And they also have a lot of artists within their congregation, so the arts are an important part of it. And my point with them, in my discussions with them, is that I think it's important for the community that they are invited and they're welcomed into the Rialto, not as part of a church event, but as part of a community event, and they've been really open to the idea of eventually doing community programming in the theater, which is what we'll be working on. So I do want to take more questions, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I've left at the tables and what I have up here. There's 2 postcards with contact information for the Theater Foundation. And there's probably not enough for everyone, but there's more up here. One has pictures of Broadway marquees, the other has pictures of the marvelous Wiltern Theater, part of the Wilshire Corridor Theater District. And then there's also some postcards from Friends of the Rialto with my website, and you're welcome to go on there and get more information. And up here on this counter, I don't have enough for everyone, but please take a peek, and if you really love it, grab it. There are some informational pamphlets for some of the theaters downtown, just to give you an idea. We have a huge range of theaters that are still active and being used, and we're trying to get them even more activated. I've met with 3 different producers, 1 Broadway producer and a couple of other producers just within the last 2 weeks about bringing big shows to Broadway. This will be game changers. So questions? Yes.
Yeah, you said about these old ones. Nowadays they are building this Nokia Center, Disney Center, Microsoft Center.
Mm-hmm.
How do they fit in all this history? Are they not going to be part of history someday?
Absolutely, they will be part of history. I had a really interesting discussion with the theater owner. He owns 3 historic theaters, and he said, "Oh, my theaters aren't historic because they're not as pretty." No, the Los Angeles Theater, that's historic because it's pretty. Now, that's not what makes history. What makes history is not just the style of the architecture, but it's the use of the building and what's happened in that theater. And there are some very plain theaters that very marvelous historic events have happened. That makes them historic. They've created those memories. Now, the new theaters that are being built, they may not be to my architectural style, but the one that was built and is hosting the Oscars every year, that's a very important theater, and it may not be my aesthetic, but it's still got value and it's still got a place. The Nokia Theater, some of these theaters are huge. The one down in the LA Live, is that the Nokia?
Yeah.
It's 7,000 seats or something. It's enormous. Now, there's very few shows that are going to fill 7,000 seats. The movie palaces downtown are 1,500 to 2,000, 2,400 at the most. That's a completely different market. So there's no real conflict there. And then something like the Alex or the Rialto, which is in the 12, 1,400 seat theater. Again, different programming. It's about filling those seats as much as possible. The Chinese, the most famous theater in the world, that's actually only 900 seats. So anyway, I do think that those have a place. As long as they're being used, then they have a place in history. Yes?
You've brought back so many memories for me, having grown up here. So I have a couple of questions, but first of all, how do you feel about Graumans Chinese being called whoever put their name on
TCL.
this week?
Yes.
Yeah, it's been,
So, glad you asked, because I actually answer this question a lot. TCL bought the naming rights of the Chinese theater for 10 years. I think they've got another 3 or 4 years left.
What's TCL?
TCL is the Creative Life. It's a Chinese electronics company. They make televisions and stereo things like that. They use this opportunity to try to break into the American electronics market. But by buying naming rights, they spent millions of dollars. The millions of dollars that they spent for the naming rights restored the theater and remodeled the theater into its current state.
added on to it.
Well, it was more about taking the IMAX, converting it to IMAX. It's now the largest IMAX theater in the world. All new seats, all new sound system. They did one of the best preservation jobs in a remodel I've ever seen, where they actually raised a giant tent inside the theater to protect all of the ceiling and walls. All of the historic elements were protected while they bulldozed and reformed all of the seating to make it stadium seating. If you haven't been to the Chinese, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite places to go. And it was the money that TCL gave for these naming rights that allowed that adaptation. So yeah, I'll take 10 years of calling it TCL if I need to get where it is.
And the second thing, is that what you really brought back for me is the memories of my youth when in the 60s and 70s, I would go to the Bruin or all the theaters in Westwood, or actually the Loyola, or the Paradise in Westchester, or the Culver in Culver City. And I remember now what they tore down the Rialto in Culver City to build the City Hall. But the one thing they did is they kind of left the facade up, and I thought that was kind of cool in a sad way.
Definitely part of the preservation conversation is what do you save? And I can't tell you that I'm happy if they save one piece or not. Sometimes it is brutal to walk by and see something that's a dental office, but they've got a box office that is original, and it kills me, yet it's still there. So yeah. Anything else? I'm probably out of time. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I would bet the greater part of LA still calls it the Roman Chinese.
Yes, yes. Absolutely. And it still is Grauman's Chinese Theater. It is absolutely still
Always
Grauman's
will be,
Chinese,
yeah.
yes.
And second part, I want to show my ignorance. What is the fly gallery?
Okay, above the stage, there, if you look on the outside of a theater, and you can almost date a theater by this, the back part behind the stage will be about twice as high as the rest of the building. And that's so that they could have the scenery flying out, flying up. So if your proscenium, your opening is this high, the building is twice as high behind it so that the curtain could go all the way up and disappear. So that's the fly gallery, the flies. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Our theme for the year is good is the new cool. And that just reflects that we all have an opportunity to make decisions in what we buy, what we do, how we act. And those decisions impact a lot of people here and globally. So thank you for inspiring us today about your hard work. And I wanted to give you this because you inspired us today, and because you were here. This is something that a woman made across the globe who's trying to get her family out of poverty. So
Oh,
you've
wonderful.
inspired us today, but yet helped to make changes across the globe.
Thank you.
And then this is an Alex Theater, or Rotary pin on the Alex Theater.
I will proudly wear this,
I
yes.
thought you might like it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.